Hi, welcome to Enlighten Me. I'm Rodney Crowder.
I'm Eddie Sanchez.
Hey, Eddie, have you seen that show Last of Us?
I haven't, but I've played the video game before.
I haven't played the game. I only watched the show, and I was really hyped when I watched the first episode because it starts off set right here in San Marcos and Austin.
Yeah, I saw that, and I was wondering if they filmed that here.
Yeah, I was wondering that too, so I went and looked it up, and man, they filmed that in Alberta, Canada. They made a fake Central Texas in Canada.
Oh man, I wonder why they didn't film it here.
Yeah, I don't know. There's been other movies and TV shows shot here. Like Piranha was shot back in the 80s, that horror movie with the killer fish was shot right in Spring Lake.
That's awesome.
And like Friday Night Lights was shot around here. Steve McQueen back in the 70s shot a movie here. So like it's not like it's new for Hollywood to come out here.
Did you know that there's actually a film studio being built out here in San Marcos? So I imagine that there's going to be a lot more filming taking place.
I heard a little bit about that, but I haven't gone into the details of it.
It's called the Hill Country Studios, and it's being built on 200 acres close to the Edwards Aquifer Recharge Zone.
Wow, that's probably gonna get some people's attention. We're very protective of our water resources here.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a lot of questions that the community had about what this meant for the environment, for the economy, for the community in general. And those were a lot of the same questions that I had. So I actually had the opportunity to talk to a couple of our faculty members from Texas State University to get some insight on that.
Oh, great. Who'd you talk to first?
So the first person I spoke with was Dr. Robert Mace from the Meadow Center.
My name is Robert Mace. I'm Executive Director for the Meadow Center for Water and the Environment. I'm also a Professor of Practice in the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies.
And he provided me with some pretty interesting insights, and he definitely alleviated, I suppose, some of my concerns that I had. So could you tell us a little bit about what your role entails as the director for the Meadow Center?
Sure. So I run the center. So there's administrative tasks, oversee an excellent team that does research on watersheds, water supply, water quality. A lot of that work is in the Hill Country, as well as along the Texas coast. We've got a group that runs the education programs that we have on site. So we run the glass bottom boats and education programs for school kids. And then we also do just quite a bit of research, including on climate change and its impacts on water resources.
That leads into what I wanted to talk with you about today. We have the Hill Country Studios, which is a $267 million project being built on 209 acres. What sort of potential environmental or systemic issues do you think could arise with that development?
Well, anytime somebody builds on property that's not been built on before, or that was natural before, has an impact. You're putting a footprint of a building, parking lots, roads, sidewalks that is impervious cover essentially. So you've covered up the local area. Depending on how the landowner interacts with the landscape, that could have some impacts. For example, if they're applying a lot of fertilizers and things to kill bugs and bacteria, that can have impacts on surface water, if it washes off during rains, or on the aquifers if it's infiltrating into the soil and deeper into the ground. There's wastewater. We have to deal with that. So depending on where your wastewater is going, if it's going to a septic system and that septic system isn't working as it should, then that can introduce contaminants into groundwater, which ultimately could come out at surface water through springs, such as San Marcos Springs.
Okay, yeah, we definitely do not want wastewater running into our clean, pure river. So how are they going to stop it?
I actually had the same question, and so I asked Dr. Mace about that.
One of the things that we pride ourselves on here at the Meadow Center is helping organizations, builders to minimize their environmental footprint, whether it's environmental impacts or impacts on water resources. And so when I guess soon after the controversy broke out, I did reach out to them to see if there was a way that we could help them achieve their goals and minimizing the footprint. And in talking with them, they were doing a number of things to achieve, minimize their footprint. The plans at that time had them putting their buildings kind of in a dense area and then having quite a bit of green space around them. They had mitigation of stormwater runoff, so runoff that comes off of parking lots and things like that. So rather than just running that into a creek that then might leak into the aquifer, they're collecting that, and there's a kind of bioremediation that occurs through these engineered systems.
Could you explain what bioremediation means?
That's using the natural environment, like naturally occurring bacteria and things like that to treat water. So if a parking lot, if you look real closely at water runs off a parking lot, if somebody's leaking oil, you'll see the sheen. That can go into some engineered swales that then uses bacteria in the soil to naturally remediate and attenuate those contaminants, before they go deeper into the ground and into the aquifer.
There was a quote that I read from the San Marcos assistant city manager. There was something in particular that they said that I wanted to see if you could maybe explain that to us. Because when I read it, I really didn't know exactly what they were talking about. But anyways, their quote is, "The studio is promising its design provides 48% impervious cover and stormwater recovery mechanisms." Are you familiar with what, I guess, impervious cover is and what some of these stormwater recovery mechanisms are? And if so, could you explain that to us?
So first on the stormwater recovery, that's kind of like that bioremediation stuff I was talking about. So rather than pushing stormwater off the site as quickly as possible, which is traditional development, it'll be retained, which has a benefit to minimizing downstream flooding, but then also there's that remediation effect, letting solids fall out. And depending what methods they use, it could be the bioremediation component. The impervious cover is related to structures, concrete that covers up the ground. It doesn't allow rainwater that falls to percolate and touch the ground. So that percentage is saying how much of their total land area is going to be covered up and not accessible to rainfall. My sense is that's on the lower side. If you go look at some of the big box retail stores where it's just a field of concrete, that impervious cover there is surely much higher than that 50% that you quoted. And that comports with the plans that I saw where they were congregating their buildings into the center and then building a buffer around the outside. And I think also that's a good design for them because it's like sound studios and things, and so they want to minimize outside noise from affecting what they're doing inside the buildings.
In consideration of all the growth happening here in Central Texas and in San Marcos, how can we better balance the needs of the greater good while doing our best to avoid negatively affecting the population and environment?
Great question. One method that folks have used across the state, including on the recharge zone for the Edwards Aquifer and other parts of the aquifer, is conservation easements. So buying the development rights to allow the recharge zone to remain in its natural state. If you can't do that, because you have to have a willing seller to do that, plus you got to have the cash to be able to buy that. And it's very expensive to do that, particularly you get close to a community like San Marcos or a city. The next best thing is to develop in a way that minimizes the footprint of the building, both literally, but then also the footprint in terms of like water use, how much water it's shedding downstream that could amplify floods.
Would the runoff potentially affect Spring Lake?
It could.
Is Spring Lake a protected body of water?
Kinda. The species that are in Spring Lake, some of those are designated by the federal government as endangered species. Those are protected. And so to a certain degree, Spring Lake and the springs are protected to protect those species. So that's why I answered the way it is.
No,
There is no direct protection of the springs in Spring Lake. They continue to flow because of the Endangered Species Act and the endangered species that live in them.
Okay, yeah, I've lived in this area around 20 years, and I've always enjoyed being out on the river or hiking on the trails. And of course, you always see, if you've ever been out there, you're never out there alone. There's always other people paddleboarding or tubing or cycling or doing whatever. People love the outdoors here. It's a huge part of why people come here. So, any big development comes to town or anywhere in this region, I know it gets a lot of attention from people who want to protect the environment. So did Dr. Mace share any of his perspective on the protests that have surrounded the studio?
I definitely got Dr. Mace's input on that.
Well, it's great that people are expressing their concern about development and expressing their concern about particularly development over the aquifer, which very well could have an impact on the springs and the river. I'm a fatalist at heart. And so, my personal opinion on that is it's private property. There hasn't been a third party to come in and buy that property to preserve it. And given that hasn't happened, then, it is the right of that owner to develop that property. This is going to sound awful because it's it could have been a junkyard with that, recycles PCBs or something. Or it could have been a big box store. My understanding is the zoning would have allowed much denser development on the property. And, it seemed like the folks that are developing the property, were aware of the concerns and were doing some things to minimize their impact. I've dealt with developers who are they're real clear. It's you can't tell me what to do. I'm going to do whatever the hell I want. So these folks just seem much more open and recognizing that there's an impact there and seeking to minimize it.
Is there anything that I can do when I go home to help with water conservation, to help with protecting the waterways in my area?
Just making decisions to minimize your water use and your water footprint. And that can be actually really easy, having water sense rated fixtures, energy sense rated appliances will automatically decrease your water use. And then making choices on your outdoor landscape. So going more towards xeriscape and natural landscaping will minimize the need for you to irrigate outdoors. I think also being aware of where your water comes from. Most Texans don't know where their water comes from. And then being attentive to those water issues and then building that information into the decisions you make when you go to the voting booth. And go to the voting booth. Voting is, it's the folks that we elect that hold various parties accountable, make the laws that turn into the rules that govern how our world works. And so voting is key as well.
Dr. Mace makes a great point. Everybody being involved is the best way for us to protect our unique environmental resources here. And when it comes to voting, the other issue that really gets people out to the polls is the economy.
Yeah, and I actually took that into consideration when fleshing out this topic, because I know that it wasn't just about the ecological effects that the studio would have in the region, but also what that would mean for the community economically, and if there are opportunities that would arise with the growth and development of the studio.
Yeah, with the great business school we've got here, I bet you could find somebody who had a little more information about what kind of positive impacts we could have from this.
Oh yeah, definitely. And I actually reached out and spoke with Dr. Joni Charles from the McCoy College of Business.
I teach a number of classes. I'm a microeconomist, so I teach the introductory level of economics, principles of microeconomics. I also teach a course called environmental economics.
Oh, what is microeconomics?
I think Dr. Charles can explain that a lot better than I can.
Yeah, so most people are familiar with the macroeconomics. So you hear things about the economy, in a broad sense, inflation level, employment level. And what microeconomics does is it looks at the decisions that consumers make within the economy, households make, and also the decision-making process of firms within the economy, and then the way that firms are organized within the economy.
I know that you focus on groundwater, right?
Mm-hmm.
So is there a tie-in between that and, I guess, microeconomics, or how do you tie that in your own work?
There is, because a lot of times you hear groundwater in terms of what it means with respect to hydrogeology. And I'm always interested in what's behind the decisions that people make when they use groundwater. And so in my most recent research, what I did was to conduct a survey, not only to find out what people's perceptions and attitudes were toward groundwater, but also I collected some survey comments about how they felt about the administration of groundwater. And then I've also done research when I've gone around to different groundwater conservation districts and talked to those who are responsible for the governance of groundwater, the professionals that are responsible for it. So micro has to do with looking at individuals and what motivates their decisions and the implications of those decisions. So that is how my teaching interest ties into my most recent research work.
Talking about the paper that you had done, I actually read through that, and I saw that quite a few people have a belief that there should be enough groundwater to sustain us for the next 50 years. We're seeing a huge population growth here in Texas, and I just thought that was kind of interesting, that it seems as if people might not realize how challenging it can be to ensure that water needs are met by municipalities and industries and all those things.
Sure, yeah. And there were two aspects to respondents' comments. One was that people seem to be pretty optimistic about there being enough groundwater. Now, this was done maybe 5 years or so ago, but people were really optimistic about groundwater, meeting the amount of groundwater and how it would meet needs currently at both state and local level, but they were less optimistic about the future. And so the question was, I think, in the next 25 years, how do you feel about our ability to meet the needs with respect to groundwater supply?
And how do you feel about the future in regards to, groundwater?
Well, I tell you, after the last 3 weeks, when we've had a lot of heat and a lot of drought, I think it'll make anybody less optimistic, because of course we haven't had that much rain. We had quite a bit in May. It seems like I was on vacation then, but since then very little. And so of course groundwater is recharged by what happens on the surface, and without very much rain, it seems like that rain may have helped to recharge the groundwater levels, but we still have July and August to go. So.
Note to our listeners, as you're hearing this, it is now probably late